First topic of the show. Most of you know this already. This is going up on Wednesday, so everybody knows at this point. But I just kind of want to share my thoughts. Stan Lee has passed away at 95. And if you don't know who Stan Lee is, like Mike Francesca, man, that was an interesting clip. If you don't know who he is, he was pretty much the biggest voice in Marvel Comics and is the reason for majority of all the Marvel movies that you love, all the characters you love. That's because of Stan Lee. That's his biggest legacy, I think, is the fact that he created so many characters that resonated with so many people, and he's such a huge pivotal role to everybody's childhood. And it's crazy to think a guy, well, like one man, well, obviously it wasn't one man, he had artists, he had contributors, they were a big part of his success, but how a guy like him could really affect people and touch people across generations. It's not just me, it's not just people that were there for the, is it the Golden Age? I think it's the Golden Age. Maybe it's the Silver Age. Silver Age. It wasn't just people that were there the Silver Age when he was active. You know, obviously somebody like me, he wasn't an active writer at the time. He was more of the guy that we know him now. But he was always somebody that fascinated me because he was always somebody that was this big cheerleader for Marvel and was truly proud of whatever he created and was very proud of his work and always a very positive light in the world. And he's somebody that I think a lot of people look up to just for that. And there was a great quote that I saw Monday when it happened, talking about how he made a statement about how he was self-conscious about the fact that all he was doing with his life were writing comic books. And, you know, on the surface, some people might feel that way. I mean, it's a different time now than probably when he was quoted about this. But, you know, you think about what's going on when you see people being architects, or I'm not going to actually do a direct quote because I can't remember it, but he was talking about how people would build buildings or be doctors and save people's lives, and how he didn't at first see any value in being a comic book writer and providing entertainment. And then he ends the quote with saying that entertainment is very important to people's lives because you could be stopping someone from going over the edge and you could help someone. And that is what really resonated with me. And I wish I had known the quote before he had passed, but that was something that really resonated with me because that's why I'm doing this. That's why I like to write for the website or do videos or do podcasts, because I love to entertain people. And I've always said the whole purpose of me doing any sort of podcasting or the time that I've been on radio or any of this stuff, it's because I want to entertain people. And my motivation for that is there are a ton of things in your life that can really affect you and make you have a bad time. There's so many things that try to bring you down, and my whole thing was whether it's a podcast or a video, it's just for 10 minutes, if I can make you forget about all the bad things in your life, I've done my job. That's always been my goal, is I want to help people in the best way I know that I can. And ever since a kid, I always saw myself as a storyteller or an entertainer. And that's what my value to society is. And somebody like Stan Lee knew that, and I think really was rah cheerleader about that and let people know that, hey, being a comic book writer isn't a bad thing. Being a podcaster isn't a bad thing. Being just a writer in general is never a bad thing. Just having that imagination and being a dreamer has its value in society. Art has its value in society. And I think we need to think of it more that way. And we absolutely need doctors. We absolutely need these people. But we need entertainers, and we need people that are very passionate about art and what they create and bring to them. So, yeah, loudandopinionated.com. I want to talk about my first exposure to Stan the Man. this is gonna sound funny, and you know what? I hope. No, I'll say it. I know that people share this experience that I do. My first ever exposure to Stan Lee was playing the Neversoft Activision Spider-Man game that came on PlayStation 1. There's also on a 64. But PlayStation 1 Activision Neversoft Spider-Man was the first time I'd ever heard Stan Lee's voice, because he narrates the whole entire game. And if anybody's played that game, it is just so much fun. Before Insomniac Spider-Man game, it was my favorite Spider-Man game. And he narrates the whole thing, and it's just, that's, I think, the beauty of what Stan Lee was, is there's just a magnetism to his enthusiasm. He has so much love and affection for his creations, especially Spider-Man, because that's his most popular creation. That's why I'm wearing my Spider-Man shirt, if you can't see it. Well, it's more of a Venom shirt, but whatever. I couldn't find a Marvel shirt that I had that I was going to wear for this. That's not the point. He had so much enthusiasm and cared so much about this character, and so when I'm playing throughout this game and I hear his narration, I'm always happy about it. It's always putting a smile on my face. I'm having a great time thinking about it now, because there's so many memories that go through that game and how much I played it, and he was a huge factor of it. So that was my first exposure to him. And then going back, I totally forgot about this, but he was definitely in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, which is what made me a huge Spider-Man fan, was the 1990s animated cartoon. And if anybody does not like Spider-Man the animated series, like that is a millennial that grew up in the 90s, you're not my friend. It's as simple as that. How can you not love that show? No, I'm just kidding, you're fine. Now, if it were Batman the animated series, if you didn't like that, then definitely, I don't need you in my life. I kind of already touched on that, but Stan Lee was one of a kind, and I don't think there could be anybody else like him, and the news was shocking, because I honestly thought he would live forever. I'm not that beat up about it, honestly. I mean, it sucks. I'm going to miss that character, but I mean, the dude was 95. He lived a hell of a life. He lived a better life than I'll probably live. I mean, that depends on how you value life, but this was a guy who was in the public eye for decades, and he lived a great life, and it's not tragic that he was 95. It's tragic in the way that we could never think we know as human beings that we're going to die, but we love the idea that people that we see on TV and movies, they can't die. It's not possible. But I just want to touch on that, where I'm going to miss seeing his cameos, and I'm going to miss him being a part of Marvel. But at the same time, he was 95, and that's really old. And I think he's going to be, I think his family is okay with it and are at peace with it, because he had lived a great life. My favorite cameos of Stan Lee in the Marvel movies, that's the real question. Because he's been in even the really bad ones of the early aughts. He's been with everything since the first X-Men movie up until Avengers 4. I read somewhere that I want to say in 2016 that he had filmed like his next 8 cameos. So we're still going to be seeing him in Marvel movies for a few more years, which makes my heart happy, because even they were like, all right, he's getting up in there in age. We got to get these in here. But I love how immediately, I think was it Joe? One of the Russo brothers immediately came out and said, yes, the cameo for him is in Avengers 4. The cameo's there. Don't worry about it. Which I wish I could remember what his cameo is in Infinity War. And that's going to bother me. I'll probably put the clip in somewhere. Yeah, my favorite cameo, I think, number one would probably be The Amazing Spider-Man. Just because that is such a funny sequence and such a different way to do it. Like, the fact that they got him to do it without a speaking part makes me laugh. because there are a few peppered out throughout the pantheon of his cameos, but most of them he has at least one line. But the fact that the Lizard and Spider-Man are having this big epic fight in the background, and he's just got these noise-canceling headphones listening to classical music while all this crazy stuff is going down in the background, and he's just going about his business. I think he's the janitor in that scene. But I would say that's my favorite Stan Lee cameo. A close second, it was probably a tie, because I do love the Guardians. Oh, man. Guardians 2 reference where he's the Watcher. Genius idea that Stan Lee is the Watcher in the MCU. That's just brilliant writing. But and I lost my train of thought. The other one, the close second, and spoiler if you haven't seen Ant-Man and the Wasp yet, but there's a sequence in Ant-Man and the Wasp where he's going up to his car to unlock the door, and I think it's one of the discs like randomly hits off and shrinks the car. And his line is, "I had a lot of fun in the 60s, but I'm paying for it now." To me, one of the funniest things he could have said, because I feel like he seems like a dude that probably partied in those days, and that that was probably a real possibility that dude took some acid. And probably my favorite cameo. I mean, it's close. It's the Amazing Spider-Man and it's Ant-Man and the Wasp. It's kind of the wrestling for the top position. And finally, I want to talk about my favorite Stan Lee creation. This one would be right out of the gate. People are going to say that's easily Spider-Man, as much as I talked about on my personal channel, as much as I've talked about Insomniac Spider-Man game, as much as I love, the animated show, how much this is contested a lot nowadays on the internet because we've had a really good Spider-Man movie since, but I loved the Raimi movies, well, the first two anyway. Spider-Man Homecoming. So Spider-Man, as I've always said, if Batman didn't exist, Spider-Man would be my favorite superhero. So that's easily what I could go with Stan Lee. But there's so many other ones. I absolutely loved Daredevil, because that was a concept that's so out there and so different, where it's like, I'm going to take, which kind of controversial too, I'm going to take a superhero that has probably the biggest flaw you can have to be a superhero, that, not a flaw, disability, sorry, that he's blind, and he's going to fight crime without sight. And I've always loved Daredevil. He's always been one of my favorites. Now, granted, Stan Lee's version wasn't as depressing as Frank Miller's stuff, or as it gets later in the history of Daredevil, but Daredevil's an awesome creation. Fantastic Four I never really connected with, or the Incredible Hulk. I get the appeal of both, but those never connected with me. Those weren't things I cared about. I never really read the X-Men, and I like the concept of the X-Men. It's just the problem with the X-Men is and this isn't Stan Lee's fault, but it gets so complicated with the X-Men. But I love the concept of that. And, they've said in interviews that it wasn't designed as a commentary on racism, which I have a quote later. I don't believe that. I think absolutely this was Stan Lee's way of dealing with social issues, because he was just a comic book writer, and he knew it. He took what he knew and he applied that to the injustices he thought were happening in the world. And I think he can say whatever he wants about how it isn't that, but I definitely feel like that's exactly what it was. And to answer my question of like what was my favorite creation, it's obviously Spider-Man, but there's so many other options. But yeah, it's got to be Spider-Man. It's his best creation, and that's the beauty of Stan Lee. People talked about that the last few days about how important of a creator he was, because he did make characters that had legitimate problems, that were real people and felt like you actually could meet Peter Parker. Like, you feel like you could see that person in Queens. And the fact that he made a teenager a superhero was not thought of at the time. And having a kid in high school dealing with all the awkwardness of high school and being a superhero was something totally new at the time. And like I mentioned with Daredevil, a blind superhero, or the X-Men dealing with prejudice and segregation, and all these things are not usually something you would get out of comic books, and he brought that to the forefront and is the biggest one. You know, you could say he's one of, but he is definitely the biggest voice. And you don't have Alan Moore, Grant Morrison, Frank Miller. You don't have these legendary comic book writers without Stan Lee. And I cannot state that enough, that he is the single most important person in comics. Yes, he had collaborators. Yes, he worked with people. That's obvious. But he's an icon. And his everlasting imprint on not only comic books but pop culture will be forever missed. And, you know, that's all I'm going to say about it. I want to end this segment of Stan Lee with one single quote that a lot of people are bringing up, that was written in '68, because back in when he was an editor for Marvel, he had his own thing called Stan's Soapbox, and it's just like one little column of whatever he wanted to riff about. And this is the one from 1968. I'm sure you've seen this somewhere, but I'm going to read this to you and just make you understand how this is just who Stan Lee was as a person. And I can't do a Stan Lee voice. I was going to think about it, but I just can't do it. Let's lay it on... Let me get in a good voice. Let's lay it right on the line. Bigotry and racism are among the deadliest social ills plaguing the world today. But unlike a team of costumed supervillains, they can't be halted with a punch in the, I want to say snout, but it says snoot, or a zap from a ray gun. The only way to destroy them is to expose them, to reveal them for the insidious evils they really are. The bigot is an unreasoning hater, one who hates blindly, fanatically, indiscriminately. If his hang-up is black men, he hates all black men. If a redhead once offended him, he hates all redheads. If some foreigner beat him to a job, he's down on all foreigners. He hates people he's never seen, people he's never known, with equal intensity and equal venom. Now, we're not trying to say it's unreasonable for one human being to bug another. Oh, that just seemed weird. Let me try it again. I'm butchering this. I'm sorry, Stan, wherever you are. Now, we're not trying to say it's unreasonable for one human being to bug another. But although anyone has the right to dislike another individual, it's totally irrational, patently insane to condemn an entire race, to despise an entire nation, to vilify an entire religion. Sooner or later, that sounded weird. Sooner or later, we must learn to judge each other on our own merits. Sooner or later, if man is ever to be worthy of his destiny, we must fill our hearts with tolerance. For then, and only then, goodness, let me try that again. I should not have read this aloud. For then, and only then, will we be truly worthy of the concept that man was created in an image of God. A God who calls us all his children. R.I.P. Rest in peace, Stan Lee. Thank you so much for what you've created, and thank you for everything.